everyone. This is Glenda Dawson. You're watching Glenda's Dragon's Den. Want to take this moment to thank you for being here, for sharing this program to allow others to also experience what you experience, and also to learn about different perspectives and different way of lives, and just to open that mind of ours to so many different experiences. I want to thank you for being here, whether you're here live or you're here later. Doesn't make any difference. And I appreciate you coming back every week. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't subscribed. It doesn't cost anything to subscribe to my YouTube channel. And I want you to this way get notifications of any future events or guests. With that being said, I just want to introduce quickly Dr. Dawson Church, who has honored me today with being here and discussing all of his experiences and basically how he got here, besides me asking him to come in. So, how are you today? Thank you for
Oh,
being here.
it is just great to be here. Thanks for having me. And I know we're going to have a fantastic conversation in the next hour.
Yes, yes, yes. So, tell us, my audience usually likes to learn about the guests, how, what major experiences they had, what changed their trajectory, what got them basically to where they are right now.
I had quite a long career, more than 20 years, in researching PTSD. And I did many clinical trials. I worked with many institutions like the California Pacific Medical Center, Duke University, Harvard, Columbia, other investigators at various universities. And the root of that inquiry was traumatic stress is incredibly impactful in people's lives. They have nightmares, they have flashbacks, they have intrusive thoughts that they just can't get rid of. And I was talking to a spiritual teacher this last week, and he was saying, well, if that thought doesn't work for you, just stop thinking it. But you can't. If you're traumatized, your brain just keeps on looping on that memory, on that stimulus over and over and over again. You cannot escape that looping trauma very easily. So I wanted to find ways of helping people move through the tragedies of their lives. And this whole research cycle for that 20 years was focused on what therapies work. How can we interrupt those looping neural patterns where the brain is just stuck in its own little private hell, and people just stay there often for years and years and years. And the tendency is to get worse. People have that neural firing going on. The neural firing produces more neural wiring, and they just tend to become like we'd get phone calls from Vietnam veterans, daughters and sons and wives, and say, it's been 40 years since Vietnam, and dad's getting crazier and more paranoid. And that's just the tragedy of PTSD. So I spent a lot of time in that research cycle. And then I moved from there into focusing more on how, when people are able to move through trauma, they then can get to peak states. Because about 2/3 of people, when they're traumatized, when they have a traumatic event, they live through a fire, they live through a landslide, they live through war, they have a terrible divorce, they have a traumatic car accident, they have a mistreatment as children. 2/3 of people actually come through it not just okay, but stronger. And that's this really underappreciated phenomenon called post-traumatic growth, where we actually can use the insults of life, and actually it makes us stronger. But 1/3 of people then spiral down into PTSD and post-traumatic stress disorder with all those symptoms I mentioned earlier. So that's been the last few big cycles of my life. And what led me to even get into PTSD research was the fact that I had a miserable, traumatic childhood myself. And I tried to get out of it by running away from home at 15 and joining a spiritual community, learning to meditate, learning energy healing, learning about the world's great perennial philosophical traditions. And so I learned a lot of that stuff when I was a teenager, and it made me a little bit happier. But again, even meditating and doing all these things, it's really hard to interrupt those dramatic cycles. And so I spent many, many years in the field of book publishing and editing initially, and then I moved into the field of psychological research and did all that work largely in an effort initially to come to grips with and try and heal my own deep wounding. And I found myself, as I did all that, and I learned these techniques and tools and did the research, I found myself becoming fairly happy, then a lot happier. And finally, my third best-selling book was called Bliss Brain. I found myself in this state of ecstasy most days. And what modern neuroscience shows us is that, sure, we look at Tibetan monks, Franciscan nuns, spiritual adepts, and they're in these ecstatic states, the
Mm-hmm.
Rumi or the state of St. Francis of Assisi. But what neuroscience is now showing us is that those brain regions are there in everybody. That brain anatomy is there, and people can be taught to fire it up. So my newest book, Spiritual Intelligence, it's all about those networks in your brain, those circuits in your brain that predispose your small, local, little human consciousness, your mind, your
Mm-hmm.
brain, your human awareness, to actually connect like a Rumi, to connect like a St. Francis, to connect like a Mary Oliver, to connect like an ecstatic poet to those great cosmic cycles, that great cosmic consciousness, and then be one with that. So that's been sort of the trajectory of me for me, from that miserable teenager running away from home, joining an ashram, to becoming a scientist, and then writing these best-selling science books about this, and then eventually breaking through to these elevated states myself, and then sharing the science behind them and how these really are the birthright of every single person. We all have this circuitry in our brains that predisposes us, that connects us through spiritual intelligence to cosmic consciousness, and then to live in that state of joy and balance every day. So that's packing 70 years, Glenda, into 7 minutes or less.
Oh, that's what you call about tight, tight packing there. Very good. Be great for traveling. Anyway, so basically what fueled you was your own experiences to get you through each stage to become better than you were the day before. And it's fantastic that within all that you have been able to bypass the bad experiences, become great, because to have a PhD you have to really go through a lot of studying, a lot of schooling, a lot of sacrifices to get there. It isn't just people getting a GED or anything like that. It's you've got to go through a lot to get there. And then taking that. Now, you talk about your latest book. You finally arrive there. Was that like an aha moment, or were you working towards that? Were you sitting there every single day meditating and doing what, layer by layer of things? Or did it just come like an awakening moment? That's
Well, I'm a science writer, and
Mhm.
when you write books that are grounded in science, then every single word of them has to be scientifically correct. And so my books are based on several hundred studies, typically 400 to 600 studies per book. So
Mhm.
my first best-selling book was called The Genie in Your Genes, and it was all about epigenetics, how our genes are affected by influences from outside the cell. And a lot of people were thinking about writing about epigenetics after the turn of the century, and they were looking at things like diet and environment, how
Mhm.
diet can shift gene expression, how environment, having a rich environment, can shift gene expression. But what I was writing about was very different. I was writing about how meditation, how spiritual experiences, how peak states, how flow states affect gene expression. And so that was my big epiphany. I put all that together in that book, and it became a bestseller. And that was really what put me on the map scientifically, was that book, The Genie in Your Genes. And still
Mhm.
today it sells. I mean, it's been 20 years and it still sells really well. A lot of people are discovering epigenetics, and just amazed that all these peak experiences are literally switching genes on and off in your body. And then about 10 or 15 years after that, I wrote the book Mind to Matter. And I was really interested in the role of the brain in consciousness. And there is an old model and an old concept of consciousness that is prevalent in the scientific literature and in consciousness research. And the model is a materialistic one that says that brains evolved over the last 3 billion years on Earth. The life has been evolving, life forms have been evolving into more and more complex forms. Eventually, we developed into really complex beings, human beings. And these human beings that we are have very complex and large brains. And those brains gave rise to consciousness. So that's the materialist model of what consciousness is. It's an epiphenomenon of a complex brain, and that perspective is interesting, but it has not one shred of scientific proof behind it. What we find when we dig into the science is that our brains are much more like a transceiver. They're much, so looking for consciousness in the brain is like looking for this program we're recording right now inside the phone on which you are watching it. It's like studying the phone and saying, where are Glenda? Where's Dawson in this phone? Picking apart the phone, trying to figure out where Glenda and Dawson are in the phone. We're not in the phone. So what I talk about, what I show in a very, very carefully constructed series of arguments with a lot of science behind them in my book, Mind to Matter, is that our brains are like the phone. But consciousness is the signal entering the phone and then projecting itself out into the outside world. And that's a much better model of consciousness. And so that book, again, has sold over 100,000 copies, been translated into many, many languages. And a lot of people have realized through that book and similar books that we literally are projecting reality out through our brains and minds onto the world around us. And then after that book was written, actually shortly before that book was published, my wife and I were living at the time in Northern California. And one October night in 2017, middle of the night, she shook me awake. I looked at my alarm clock. It said 12:45. I looked out the window. She said, something's really wrong. And I ran outside, and there was a wildfire that was just swooping down the adjoining valley toward our house. And I just screamed at her, we're getting out of here right now. And we literally ran through the house, grabbing shoes, no time for socks, grabbing jacket, no time for a shirt, grabbing our phone, no time for anything else, sprinting to our car through a hellscape of flames and driving at high speed out of there to escape this wildfire. Within a few hours, it consumed over 5,000 homes around us. Many people lost their lives. It was just a devastating experience called the Tubbs Fire, one of several wildfires, California wildfires that have swept through the area over the last 10 years. And suddenly, overnight, we found ourselves with literally no possessions other than the car we'd driven out with, our phones, and our clothes on our backs. And that initiated a period of incredible turmoil in our lives, losing everything. The next year, because of all the financial upheavals, we lost all our money. So here we were, in our 60s, just with this complete devastation of our lives. But we were meditators. We meditate every single day. We do EFT, acupressure tapping on acupressure points to release stress, which is the main way we treat people with PTSD. And we were using all of our techniques on ourselves. And even in the midst of losing absolutely everything, we were pretty happy. And I thought I got to write a book about this. So I wrote another science book called Bliss Brain. And it's largely drawing on the experiences and the research of Tibetan monks, Franciscan nuns, other people who are entering these elevated states every day. But I wanted to explain how you can lose everything, and with the tools of post-traumatic growth, still really be fine. Be fine inwardly, be resilient inwardly. So that book, This Brain, again, really helped people understand that the science behind how you can be happy even after loss and what post-traumatic growth is. And then I began after that writing my book, Spiritual Intelligence. And the big surprise of Spiritual Intelligence was discovering, as I looked at all the research, over 400 scientific studies are covered in that book, is it is highly neurologically based. These monks, these nuns, their brains, when we put them in an MRI, their brains look different and their brains function differently. So I looked at all the research on brain anatomy, brain physiology, brain function, brain connectivity. Which parts of the brain talk to which other parts of the brain? And so that became the book Spiritual Intelligence. And we found that these people have very different brains, not because they start out that way, because of how they use them. And just the way if you go to the gym, and one analogy I described my goal at one point in my life, I wanted to bench press, go to the gym and be able to lift, bench press 200 pounds. And I would go to the gym every 2 days. I'd sit there on the bench press. I'd bench press. Now I could only bench press 150 pounds. I was a long way from my goal, but bit by bit, I built up my biceps, built up my pectorals, and I lifted, eventually it was 155 pounds, and 160, 162, 165. Bit by bit, over the course of more than a year, I gradually built my muscles up to where I had enough muscle mass to bench press 200 pounds. And our brains work the same way. If you pass a signal through your anger circuit every day, your anger circuit gets bigger. If you pass a signal through your compassion circuit every day, your compassion circuit gets bigger. And so these monks and nuns began with the same brain as everybody else, got a standard issue human brain that everyone else gets as well. But they began to use them differently with all these emotions like kindness, empathy, awe, gratitude. These are people who are deeply and fundamentally compassionate, empathetic, grateful, feeling a sense of awe in their lives. Now, again, they have nothing. They have no physical possessions. They're monks and nuns. They have nothing at all that they own. And yet when we look at them in terms of their happiness and the way their brains function, they are off the charts in terms of the waves being emanated from their brains in the happiness spectrum of brainwaves. So I became interested in these people, began to write about them, and then realized, if you and I exercise our brain the same way that they do, our brains change, and way faster than muscles change. If you look at the structure of neurons and actual live neural tissue under an electron microscope, those neurons are trembling as they fire together, and then they move close together and they wire together. And in 12 seconds, you can go from firing to wiring. Every 12 seconds, you're building new neural tissue in your brain. So you do that for 30 days. I ran a randomized controlled trial showing that in just 1 month of meditation, very, very specific form of evidence-based meditation, science-based meditation, building up those parts of your brain, we put people back in the MRI after only 1 month, and their brains were different. These were ordinary people. They weren't monks and nuns. They weren't meditators. But in just a month, using science-backed techniques, their brains looked like the brains of people who've been meditating for hundreds of hours, thousands of hours. So that's the exciting discovery of my newest book, Spiritual Intelligence, that we all have what we call the Enlightenment Network inside of our skulls already. But for most people, it's shut down by stress. You have to release stress, and then you have to deliberately cultivate spiritual intelligence with meditation. And so there are lots of practices in the book. Each chapter ends with deepening practices. I tell you what to do, where to go, what practices to do to cultivate spiritual intelligence, and then fire those networks, grow those circuits, activate those parts of the Enlightenment Network, and then move into those blissful states. So that's sort of the trajectory of writing and science that I followed. And now we're realizing the big aha is that we've all got the Enlightenment Network. If we just fire it up, it radically transforms our lives. and makes us so blissful and so resilient that our house can burn down. I mean, we aren't happy about, all our neighbors
Hmm.
losing their lives and people
Hmm.
dying. We're as empathetic as everyone else, but we have a core of resilience and a core of joy that cannot be burned. I have one image from the fire when we had a friend who got in there the day after the fire and took pictures of
Hmm.
where our house used to be. And there was just a concrete slab, chimney sticking up, and then ash. Nothing else. Everything just was burned to ash. Office, same thing. Office was just a concrete slab with ash all over it, where everything, the computers had burned, the desks had burned. But when the closet burned and when the cabinets burned, when everything burned up, there had been an old stone Buddha that had been stuck in a storage cabinet many years before, and then we'd pile papers in front of it. We totally forgot that it was there until everything burned down. So there's this image of this Buddha sitting there, big stone Buddha, totally serene with
Wow.
ash. Everything's burned all around it, but the Buddha remains. And that's the big message of all of this work, is that your whole life can turn to ashes, but the Buddha and the compassion, the love. So I wrote in the book, love doesn't burn, empathy doesn't burn, kindness doesn't burn, awe, gratitude, all of these things they can live vibrantly in our hearts in the middle of tragedy. And I think that's the big discovery that we're finding here, is that we have these abilities in us. They can survive even the loss of everything on the outside.
And the best part is that you have proven it scientifically. So even for those that are left-brained only, the users left brain only can kind of see it and experience it, learn how to experience it for themselves. I know that I've lived through hurricanes and floodings and lost everything too. So it's kind of like the opposite of yours, where you went up in smoke and I went floating away. But I was, when I came back to see everything, I actually said thank you. Thank you, because you gave me the warning. You gave me the clarity to leave when I did. And, my children, our pets, everything that mattered truly was there. So, and, I still remember those days where I was like, you know what? It's going to work out. No matter what, we're going to be fine. And then I ended up saying to myself, okay, let's leave New Jersey and we'll move to Pennsylvania. And we have a great house. We have a huge house where now even my daughter and her husband and the grandkids can live in, where I have the first floor, they have the rest of the house because there are too many of them. And so I look back and I said, that happened for that reason. That had to happen to show me that even though I'm very spiritual and I've always been connected and I've always been, very, very goal oriented, it could still go, and yet I still exist. So,
That's right. And we discover that as spiritual beings, when we recognize ourselves to be consciousness itself, and this
mhm,
is the great teaching of the world's perennial philosophy.
right.
Aldous Huxley articulated the perennial philosophy that this is what underlies all the world's religions, and he articulated this in the 1920s, 1930s. He said there are three common principles to the world's perennial philosophy that underlies all the religions. One of those one of those three elements of the perennial philosophy is that under this world of change, our bodies change, the seasons change, the earth changes, even planets eventually die, suns become black holes, and everything passes away. But under this world of change, there is a changeless reality. That's principle number one of the perennial philosophy. Principle number two is that an element, a spark of that unchanging is in every human being. And principle number 3 is that it is our life mission to discover that and live as that spark of the eternal, that spark of the eternal consciousness. And your life is completely different when you are living as an expression of consciousness itself. In the teachings of the non-dual masters, and the ones that I follow are ones like Ramana Maharshi and Ramakrishna and Anandamayi Ma. And so you'll find the teachings of these masters in my books, and they talked about non-duality. They talked about oneness of individual consciousness and the cosmic consciousness that holds us all. So our minds, our local awareness is meant to be an expression of that cosmic consciousness. And when you live as that every day, living from the inside out, living as an expression of the light, the beauty, the sheer brilliance of that and grace of that internal state, when you're living that out every day, when that's your reality, you have a completely different reality that's inner directed, that's different from people whose reality is outer directed. So you still have to have a job and kids and pay your taxes and drive on the right side of the road when you're in America and the left side of the road when you're in England.
Hopefully.
Yeah, but don't want to forget that one. So you're still doing this stuff with the outside world, but you're doing it from a very, very different perspective. You're doing it as a conscious being, and you find that there's so much love on the other side of that veil. There's so much kindness. There's so much beauty. There's so much grace out there. And so your life then becomes one of expressing that in the outside world. And again, in the case of for me being a science writer, you find it in science. You find that science just reinforces this. We find that science shows us how we have these abilities, and that there's incredible amounts of proof now that what we think of as the material world is highly malleable, that it really responds to consciousness. And so we discover how we can shift our awareness to align with cosmic consciousness and then live in that way from the inside out. So it changes everything, whether you're living like through a flood the way you did, or through a fire the way I did. Living from the inside out, living as consciousness present in a body, just changes everything.
Definitely. And I could see how all this would help someone with PTSD rise above it and change the way they live from the inside out, and hopefully, excuse me, hopefully be able to rise to the point where they can. I don't know if I should say cure or not cure, but manage their symptoms, manage their experiences.
No, cure is a good word, because
Okay.
we've moved in medicine. If you look, go back to medical texts in the 50s,
Right.
they talked about cure a lot. Now they talking about managing symptoms, but back then they were very focused on curing.
Right.
And what we find is we measure PTSD. We have measurements like the PTSD scale that's used by the Veterans Administration and many other places. We can also measure PTSD in the brain. We find that in the brains of people with PTSD, the memory and learning centers shrink and the stress centers grow. In monks and nuns and people with spiritual intelligence, the opposite happens. Memory and learning centers get bigger, stress centers start to shrink. So we can measure this both biologically in people and psychologically. And when they discover spiritual intelligence, when they learn to release the emotional impact of all those past events, which they do, we can like, we're training people in the VA right now, and they will be taking veterans that have had decades of PTSD. They'll be giving them about 5 1-hour treatment sessions. And when those veterans walk out of their office after 5 1-hour sessions, those symptoms are just gone, never to return, or rarely to return. And that's in 9 cases out of 10. 1 case out of 10 we can't cure, but 9 out of 10 people, those symptoms just go away. So we truly have a cure for PTSD. We're using that in Rwanda. We've used it in Rwanda a lot over the last 25 years. We use it in Ukraine now. Next week, I'll be training psychologists in Ukraine. So we are using it in the world's conflict zones, in some of the most tragic parts of our globe,
Mm-hmm.
to help people escape the symptoms of PTSD. So, they're very curable. And then you have to stabilize them initially and help them find their feet and find themselves again.
Right.
Later on, you can encourage them to meditate and then have them have these peak experiences. Now, that person who was so stuck in suffering becomes that radiant being of light as they move into these transcendent states and live their lives from those places. So often, again, that tragedy, the fire, the loss, the war, is able to propel you into seeking those elevated states, finding them, and then living from that perspective.
That is so beautiful. I'm like, wow. That is because I know a lot of veterans, and I know a lot of them that have seen war, have seen battles, have seen too much and experienced too much. So this is definitely, this is encouraging for them and for me because they're such good souls, and you see it in there, but they're afraid of even Fourth of July,
Yes,
that kind of thing. So this is wonderful.
they're afraid of
Um,
walking past a Chinese restaurant. They're
yes,
afraid of a car backfiring. I mean, they manage their lives around not triggering themselves with all of these stimuli,
right.
and it doesn't have to be that way. I worked with one young veteran, and somebody, when we were talking in an office, somebody walked by with a water bottle that they finished drinking the water out of,
Right.
and they crinkled the water bottle,
Oh,
making this sound. And this young veteran who served in Iraq, he was ready to dive under the table. He was so triggered that it sounded to him like gunfire. And after only about 30 minutes of treatment, 30 minutes, that's all it took. And then we could have somebody pick up that water bottle, crinkle it, make that sound, and he was totally calm. So it does not take long to treat these traumas, and people are able to recover from these maladaptive stimuli. If
mhm,
they don't do that, their responses, again, that adverse neural wiring and firing, means their symptoms will get worse over time. But
mhm.
now, again, the VA is using these methods, National Health Service in Britain's using them, a lot of disaster relief organizations are using them. So I believe that we will largely cure and eradicate PTSD globally over the next century. I think that there'll be initiatives all over the world to bring these treatments into primary care. And anxiety, depression, PTSD, many of these conditions they're going to disappear, just the way cholera, dysentery, typhoid, all those disappeared a century ago. Very, very
Right.
quickly. Once we had the cure, those cures spread within 20 years or so, they were all gone. I can see it a time when all of these mental afflictions, PTSD, anxiety, depression, very, very quickly are treated globally, worldwide. The pendulum swings, and we have a dramatically more mentally healthy world.
That would be wonderful. That would be wonderful. Uh, I'm looking forward to it, to seeing that. I really am looking forward to it.
Glenda, you and I may live to see it.
We we will. We will.
Our
You know,
grandchildren will.
sometimes they let us stay around just to see the good, you know?
Yes.
So, um now have you tried to teach counselors that work with abused spouses or persons, like like in a bad marriage where there was a husband who beat up the wife all the time, or vice versa? Because I know that a lot of men will not admit that they're abused, but I know that there are many men that are physically abused and emotionally abused and mentally abused by their spouse. And but the society does not allow men to show that they're weak, even though that's not being weak. It's just you get yourself, unfortunately, into caught in their web, and before the person knows it, they're already in it, stuck, tied in, and that's it. So I could see that this type of cure could work there too, very easily.
Yeah, so it is used in quite a number of domestic violence shelters,
Hmm.
and you're right. Our focus is on women who, again, women are physically smaller,
Right,
and often they're more vulnerable for various reasons, and so they are abused at higher rates than men.
right.
But the rates of domestic violence against men by women is actually higher than you'd expect. And so there is that. I remember the first time I ran into this was when I was managing a company many years ago in the 1980s, and there was this one really tall, handsome guy who was one of the main laborers
Hmm.
in in the company, and everyone liked him. He was very pleasant, very sweet, very affable, and but we noticed that he would occasionally show up at work with bruises, and we realized that his wife was pounding on him. So and she was had a lot of emotional issues. So again, there are these things. So what we will do, and what is usually necessary, is you have to separate the people.
Hmm.
It's very hard to heal if you are still in that abusive situation. If it's an abusive boss, an abusive work relationship, it's I mean, you can try and heal while you're in it, but it's just better to get out. So
Right.
we do often recommend people just remove themselves from that
Hmm.
source of stress. It's very hard to heal if you're in the middle of it. So now this is impossible for children. Children are trapped. They're just stuck there. They can't leave home. They can't go to college. They can't, move to Pennsylvania. They're 5 years old. What do? You just have to stay there and cope. And
Right.
that's where they have these coping strategies like dissociation. They dissociate themselves from their bodies. They dissociate themselves from their emotions. Those are also very hard to treat afterwards. So, but yeah, we even have tools that treat in my program, in my training program. We actually have tools that can treat dissociation and also pre and perinatal trauma. What happens if your mom was traumatized and stressed when you were in the womb?
Mhm.
Cortisol goes right through the placenta into the baby's body, and a whole bunch of us were learning the biochemistry, the neurochemistry of trauma in our bodies in the womb through the placenta. So what do you do? So we've had to develop tools to work on pre and perinatal trauma. Is it easy? Not at all. Is it possible? Yes. And I'd encourage people, even if you have severe trauma, complex PTSD, again, it may not be easy, it may not be quick. I don't want to say, 5 sessions for
No,
everybody.
no.
In fact, in our treatment guidelines, we recommend at a minimum of 10 sessions, because 5 sessions to start to get yourself unstuck, another
Right.
five to begin to really balance your life, and
Mhm.
then you keep on doing this the rest of your life. I mean, I've been doing energy healing of one kind or another for 60 years, and I still work on myself almost every day. I'm doing some
Mhm.
tapping. I'm definitely meditating every single day. So I wake up at around 5:30 in the morning. I do some energy tapping. I release any lingering imbalances from the night, from sleep, from dreams, and then I just enter those elevated states, what in Sanskrit's called samadhi, these states of elevated consciousness. You just go and hang out there in the universe for one writer calls the great silence, or the great
Right.
eye of stillness, is what I first called it in my journal when I was journaling about it many years ago. So you
Mhm.
go hang out there for an hour or two, and then you come back, and you have to still do all the stuff of normal life. You have to make sure
Right.
the refrigerator has food in it, and that the baby's diapers are changed, and whatever it
Right.
is you have to do. But it's just transformative to spend at least part of your life in that space. Now, not everyone's going to have an hour in the morning to meditate, but you certainly can find 15 or 20 minutes or so in the morning to meditate. And the other big benefit of meditation is that I did one study, and I looked at the productivity of people who meditate. And again, this is not just any random meditation, because most things people call meditation are not very effective. So you have to use an evidence-based meditation. You'll find them in Spiritual Intelligence. Read my books, you'll find them there. And you'll find links to free ones in the books as
Mhm.
well. And so use evidence-based meditations. And what happens when you do that is we measured their productivity at work, how productive they were at home, how productive were they after they began meditating. We found that in only a month, their level of productivity went up 20%. 20%, that's like getting an extra day in your week
Mm-hmm.
in only 1 month of using a science-backed meditation. So these people actually become not lost in they aren't like space cadets. They become intensely practical. Like when we measure these monks and nuns, they are compassionate, they're effective. They're the people they're running the orphanages and manning the soup kitchens, and they're the first responders in many parts of the world where there's no developed infrastructure. They're the first responders to disasters. So
Mm-hmm.
they are highly practical, they're highly productive. And we find that ordinary people, when you begin meditation within only a month, can raise your productivity by 20%. They're even more productive a year later. So it's a practical way to live your life.
Wonderful. And I am so blessed and grateful that you are sharing all this with with me, my audience, the world, because finally somebody has been able to take science, spirituality, and prove that they work together and that it makes sense. That, by even the studies that you do of the brain and all that, and the productivity, you have scientifically done the work, which this way it cannot be just, oh no, that's woo woo, as a lot of people call it. Um, like I've done healing energy basically all my life. I did before I even knew what it was. Um, so it works well hand in hand. The best time of my day is when I wake up early. Yes, everybody could start laughing because or my early is like 8 o'clock in the morning. But when I had the kids, under me, and they were in high school and all that, I did have to get up 5, 6 o'clock in the morning. I would sit outside for 10 minutes with my coffee, just looking at everything, just enjoying. Even now in Pennsylvania, I have a big backyard and just a whole bunch of trees that I planted and plants and all that. So I just sit there, and in the summertime, I hear the birds and just a whole different other environment before all the noise comes in.
Yeah, so you
And
give yourself that pause in your day.
right,
That's your meditation.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And then I could start my day doing whatever I need to do. The 3D things, like I keep saying.
Yeah,
So
the 3D world.
3D world, yes. So now you said you had such a traumatic life that you ran away when you were 15. Were you that young when you left your house, or you wanted to?
Yeah, no, I was. I was 15 years old, and I got deeply involved with the spiritual community, and it was really transformative to find people with spiritual depth. My father was a minister, and he was a really well-intentioned man. He was a brilliant speaker, and my mother was a clergy wife, so she was also very active in the church. All my aunts and uncles, people in my family, they were all clergy. They were all deacons and priests and involved in various churches, different denominations, various all people of faith. And I saw growing up in the church so much abuse and so much hypocrisy. It just disgusted me. Even as a 5-year old, I was just, I wanted to be an atheist because it was like, if this is what God's all about, all this abuse and neglect and hypocrisy. I don't want any part of it. So
Right.
that was me at the age of 5, 5-year-old closet atheist. And when I joined the spiritual community, initially I was very inspired by the perennial philosophy and about all
Yep.
these ideas. But I soon discovered that the community was as abusive as any church, and there was all this abuse going on under the surface, and all these promises being made and not kept, and people being manipulated. And so we find that in virtually every spiritual group. And so what do we do? Where do we go? And what I do now is I actually teach a class called The Short Path to Oneness, and it's based on the teachings of Ramana Maharshi. And Ramana Maharshi did not have a guru, did not have an ashram that he entered. He simply was tuning into nature. He was tuning into his inner reality. And that's like you sitting out there with your cup of coffee and watching the birds. He was intensely involved with a mountain called Arunachala that he felt was his teacher and the source of his wisdom. And he would walk around the mountain almost every day. And so what we teach in the Short Path to Oneness is, by all means, if you find a great teacher, go learn from them, but find your inner teacher, because you can't be betrayed by your higher self. You can't be betrayed by the universe. And so you want to always have the litmus test of, does this feel good to me? Does this feel right to me? So I also have friends who are spiritual teachers. I follow them. I meditate with them. I love the benevolence of their presence, but it's always from within. No spiritual teacher can enlighten you. Spiritual teachers just can't. No drug trip, no psilocybin trip, no ketamine trip. They can certainly shut down the parts of your brain that make you suffer for a few hours to where you experience the ultimate reality. But then you are faced with the job of getting there yourself. And so that's really what you have to learn to do. The drugs, the gurus, the spiritual highs, they can get you into that state temporarily. Then you have to go back and cultivate spiritual intelligence to the point where you can get yourself there. So how will you do that? And that's why we really focus on the practices of spiritual intelligence in the Short Path to Oneness. You want to develop these abilities in yourself, and we can do it. We find in 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, doesn't take long. If we nurture people, guide them, mentor them, we can grow those neurons. They're firing and wiring together. Now, after a while, they're having these elevated experiences of transcendence, and they don't need the drugs. They don't need the guru. They are doing it entirely generated from their own experience, and your life then becomes incredibly rich. So you want to develop these abilities in yourself. By all means, again, study with these other people. But again, no matter, one of my friends, David Gandelman, he said that I went to India so many times. I spent over $100,000 on trips to India, went to all these ashrams, studied with all these gurus, got Shaktipat, the blessing that the guru gives by touching you on the forehead, from all these teachers. And he said they were wonderful experiences, but they always faded. I had to learn to get there myself. And so that's essentially what you have to learn to do. You have to learn to move yourself into those states. And that's the development of spiritual intelligence. But the good news from the research is that it doesn't take a long time. In one study, we found that 30 days of using the science-backed meditation technique was able to move people into brain states that looked like those of 10,000-hour meditators. So in only a month of consistent practice, you can move yourself to that state and be then having those transcendent experiences to where you don't ever need the crutches, the gurus, the drugs ever again. Do you still enjoy the gurus? Do you enjoy the teachers? Absolutely. I go see spiritual teachers and sit there at their feet and learn from them, enjoy their radiance. But you don't need that because you've learned the illumination from within.
I got to tell my students, I'll give you the tools and how to use them. It's up to you to use them. You take it from there, and whatever high you feel when I'm teaching you, you can reach that high again with those tools.
That's right.
That's all you need. And
it's like having a target. You hit, the teacher can show you how to hit the target.
Exactly.
And once you don't hit the target one time, you can hit the target again after that. But you need training and help initially in getting to the target. Exactly. You don't even know where the target is to begin with. So you're shooting blind.
Right. Oh Lord. So now this last book we were talking about, what inspired you to actually write that book, research more about it, and write that book? Because I know that there's always that moment in time where, as a writer, you're like, oh, wait, and the idea comes out and sparks. You could actually see that light bulb go on, and you just then take it from there to the actual book. But
yeah. Yeah, well, I wanted to write spiritual intelligence. The light bulb, originally I was writing about spiritual intelligence as an experience. What is the enlightenment, the awakening experience? What is it like for people? And what are the characteristics of people with spiritual intelligence? So if you think about, like right now, just imagine, who do you see as a being of spiritual intelligence? And people say, oh, Martin Luther King or Mohandas Gandhi or Mother Teresa or the Dalai Lama. So we all kind of have an intuitive sense of what is spiritual intelligence. So I was writing about that sense of these characteristics. But what I discovered as I began to dig into the science behind it was that it is extremely neurologically based, that you have to fire those circuits and wire them big enough where you can have convey enough information inside your brain to bring you to that experience. And so, chapter one is all about the four circuits of the Enlightenment Network. There are four circuits that scientists trace. They're very well understood by neuroscience, and these people with high spiritual intelligence are firing those four circuits. They also have learned to shut down the stress circuits, which impede the Enlightenment Network. So, chapter one is all about the four circuits of the Enlightenment Network. Chapter two is all about that bench pressing, about how to grow those circuits and make them big enough to where they start to get larger in your brain and the stress circuits start to shrink. And so there's a lot of research showing, like, there's some parts of the brain that if you're meditating right will start to grow at 10% a month. I mean, that's a lot.
That's a lot.
Imagine your muscles growing 10% a month.
Mm.
You work them out. Well, your parts of your brain are growing at 10% a month if you are meditating in an effective way. So chapter two is all about parts of the brain that grow, also parts of the brain that shrink. And so I talk a lot in chapter two about Alzheimer's disease, because in the Alzheimer's brain shrinks. People go through cognitive decline. And in one of the images, spiritual intelligence has lots and lots of images in the book. There are tons of illustrations, pictures, infographics of various people doing various things. So there's a ton of imagery in the book, as well as a ton of information. And I have an image of an Alzheimer's brain, a real live post dissection Alzheimer's brain,
Mhm.
65 years old Alzheimer's patient who died, next to a normal 65-year-old brain. The Alzheimer's brain has shrunk 70%.
Wow.
That's how much Alzheimer's can shrink your brain. So these monks and nuns, these parts of the brain are growing. Alzheimer's patients, the shrinking. And then I end chapter two on brain shrinkage and growth with the research showing that when we teach Alzheimer's patients who already have cognitive decline and brain shrinkage, when we teach them effective meditation, their cognitive decline stops and their brains start growing again. This
Ooh,
is absolutely amazing.
chills all over.
The Alzheimer's Society of America is about promoting meditation because of these studies. Several high quality randomized controlled trials showing the brains of Alzheimer's patients start growing again when they learn to meditate. So that's chapter two. Chapter three is called the tipping point, because you grow the circuits of compassion big enough. So now you've been bench pressing, you've been meditating, you've been developing spiritual intelligence, you reach the tipping point, and at the tipping point, one day you don't have enough muscle fibers, brain fibers, the next day you do. Like, I remember when I was wanting to bench press 200 pounds, I was trying for more than a year. I was gradually raising the amount of weight I lifted. My arms were getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Eventually, I added the last muscle fiber, and boom, that day arrived. I could bench press 200 pounds. Same thing with meditation. You meditate, people say to me sometimes, Dawson, I'm using the meditations in the book. I'm going to the end of the chapter. I'm downloading your free meditations. Nothing's happening. I say, just keep doing it. Just the way I bench press for all those months to reach
Mhm.
pounds, you just keep adding neurons to those circuits. They get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. 1 day you add the last neuron and you tip into awakening. So that's the tipping point. And that was one big motivation to write the book, because people don't understand it's just a matter of developing those circuits big enough. And then one day, if you just persist, you reach the tipping point and suddenly, wham, you're having that non-dual experience. I and the universe are one. So you
Mm.
now have done this, you built up enough neural capacity, then it becomes your everyday experience. Then you begin to have experiences of light. There's light, you feel light in your mind, light in your brain, light in your body. After a while, light starts to shine out all around your body. There are people I spend time with, they're literally glowing. They look like light bulbs. There's so much light just pouring out of their bodies, these amazing beings that are examples of spiritual intelligence. And so that's where we move to after a while. But they just have enough neural structure to generate that light, and you literally will feel yourself at that point in your meditative journey floating in light. When I meditate in the morning, I sit there, and it doesn't happen right away. In fact, I was talking to a famous qigong master this last week, and he was saying it takes me 15 to 20 minutes to move into being the light body, but he does. And then after a while, this is a radiant man, and you just see him becoming light. And that's what happens to every human being. We all have that circuitry to have that light experience. Your body also feels very light at that point. You feel like you're floating off your meditation cushion or couch or whatever you're sitting on. So you're now having this experience. And so chapter 3 is the tipping point to get there. Chapter 4 is about the awakening experience. We now have 2 databases with over 4,000 people in them describing their awakening or enlightenment experiences. We know what the experience is like. And so I explain what the science tells us about those people, what they experience when they awaken and when they live the awakened life. When they reach the tipping point, they've gone from being a seeker of enlightenment to being a finder. And what's it like to be a finder? What does the experience of finders look like? It is very different. I mean, they are so happy. There aren't even words in the English language to describe how happy they are. We have to use Sanskrit to describe these happy states of the awakened experience. Chapter 5 is all about what happens in the rest of our lives and flow states. We move into flow states throughout our day. We meditate in the morning. We then have a day of flow. What does flow look like? What does the research show us? How do we pursue flow? Then in chapter 6, I talk about what happens to the brain when you are doing this and how it changes, and how evolutionary changes that used to take tens of thousands of years or generations, we're now seeing in evolution. We now see evolution happening in an incredibly speeded up way in all kinds of research. So evolutionary changes that used to take 10 million years, we're now seeing in like 30 years in some studies. It's just amazing what's going on with evolution. People don't realize that evolution is speeding up dramatically in many ways. And then finally, chapter 7 is all about the kind of world this will produce in the next 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years. It'll be radically different from the world of today. So I wanted to convey this arc, this trajectory of all the way from those 4 circuits of the Enlightenment Network to how you can grow those happy parts of your brain, how you reach the tipping point, you have the awakened experience, how your brain then starts to really shift, and how this changes the world. We are, by moving into being the light, by being love, being compassion, we sit there in meditation, millions of us every day. And Glenda, you may feel like that, one person when you're sitting there with your cup of tea or coffee and looking at nature in the morning. You're one of millions of people doing that. I'm one of millions of people. There are millions of us just radiating love, light, compassion, and that is moving out of us into the psychosphere, the sum total of the consciousness of the planet, and it's changing. And there are all kinds of examples I give at the end of the book about how society is changing very, very quickly under the influence of all these compassionate people who are living in human bodies right now, how it's changing the planet in a good way. So if you want to see the big sweep of history, that's chapter 7. And I wrote the book to show how you may think you're this one person and powerless to deal with Ukraine, to deal with
Right.
the genocide in Gaza? How can I deal with the tragedy and the starvation in Darfur in Africa? How can I help victims of these huge global problems? You help by radiating the light, by radiating spiritual intelligence, by being that loving, compassionate human being right where you are. You are emitting energy into the psychosphere of the planet, and that is eventually producing widespread social change. So we may seem small, individual, ineffective. But Margaret Mead, the great anthropologist, said, never believe that a small group of committed people cannot change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has changed the world, is that small group of committed people. So that's why I'm here, why you're here, why we're all here. You, by listening to Glenda and me today, you're electing yourself into the club of
There you go. And it's a great club, by the way. It's
it's a
a
great
very good club. Oh, that's wonderful. So, for the audience, all the links are going to be in the description. And please, this is like one of those books that you just have to get. You just have to read, you just have to get, because just by reading it, I could tell just by reading it, not even doing the exercises, the meditations, or anything like that, it's going to raise your vibrations and it's going to then help you give more love and more peace and more light out to the world just by reading it. I could just tell. It's not judging a book by its cover, but it's the way that you brought it, the light that you showed when you were talking about it. I know that that light is in the book, and I know that that light is going to glow when anybody just reads the book. So, is there anything else that we haven't talked about that you would like to tell the audience?
I think that the main thing we need to remember is we live in a world, and we often are raised in a way that fills our heads with limitations. I can't do this, I can't feel this good, I can't be this happy, I can't accomplish that. And what the message of science is you can. That a lot of those limitations are self-imposed. They're not true. They aren't who you are. They're just a story you tell yourself. And so we tell ourselves we have to live small lives. We're limited. We can't be as happy as the next person. And all these stories in our heads. Spiritual intelligence helps you get out of that old story and embrace who you are as this glorious being of pure consciousness that happens to be temporarily for 70 or 100 years inhabiting a body. And you live as that, and then you start to find the potential of the universe pouring through you. So that's really the big message here, is that you want to let go of those self-limiting beliefs about who you are, release trauma that's holding you back. You still have to release the trauma. You can't do spiritual bypassing. You have to go there and do the deep emotional work, let it go. But it doesn't have to take a long time. You can release it, and then you live as this being of lightness. And we find these people who are doing this have dramatically happier lives. They're off the charts, literally, in terms of brain function when it comes to reading their happy brain waves. They have 7 times the amount of this wave called gamma, characteristic of joy, that the average person has in their brain. So you too can be that incredibly light person dancing through your life, just living like a child does, living spontaneously, living joyfully. And my real goal is to play a small role in awakening that realization among everyone, cultivating your spiritual intelligence and letting your light shine fully.
That's beautiful. That is beautiful. What a great way to end this. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being so grateful to uh, accept my invitation. I want to thank the audience again. Please remember to hit that share button so others can also benefit from all these shows. I want to thank you. And as I always end this, remember, I love you. Bye.